What we'd like to do is hear from 3 or 4 of you, questions or comments, and then the panelists will respond. So, who'd like to start?
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Paku. I'm a local here in Kansas City. As I was listening to your 3 presentations and thinking about the power of narrative and how narrative shifts culture and politics, I am a digital campaigner and organizer, so we do a lot of storytelling in the campaigning work that we do. And we work with many different undocumented communities and as part of the campaign work that we do. I'm curious to hear some reflections from you all about the challenges, I think particularly as I was listening to you, Chris, talking about really significant intersections around power, identity, place, story, and how that impacts the kinds of stories that we can tell to leverage power to change policy or legislation or culture. I think oftentimes we work with communities that where there's a real push to have a respectability politic about like being the respectable immigrant and what that looks like, and that the respectable immigrant, the hardworking immigrant, the immigrant striving for meritocracy is actually the immigrant that's the narrative that will change people. And in fact, we're working on a campaign right now with adoptees where criminal histories are making it almost impossible to tell a moving story that will change legislation for these particular adoptees who are seeking citizenship. So I'm curious just to hear from you all how respectability politics impacts the way you tell immigrant stories and what's effective or not effective.
Do we have another comment or question before our panelists respond?
Yes, and thank you. My name's Barb, and thank you for sharing your work and your research. And I just have a simple question because I've had the opportunity to get to know some recent Congolese refugees here in Kansas City. And what I see with them, and also the Somali community here, is very close family units, very close community within this group. And I'm just wondering if that goes on indefinitely, or if at some point it does diffuse the way we've seen other immigrant groups.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I'm starting a children's publishing company right now, and I'm also an adjunct professor. I work with a lot of immigrant students currently also. And my largest question is, how does immigration affect children? I know that there's a lot of issues with assimilation, and they don't talk about politicalism or power, and they're just trying to fit in. And have you ever brought that on the table for kids under the age of 18 years old at all? And once you capture their stories, what are you doing with them? Are they just on the web or just kind of floating around, or where are they at once you get those stories from the people as well?
Thank you very much for your questions. Why don't we turn to the panelists?
I'll start. So I'll start with the first question. So the most important technology that was ever invented is language, right? And partly because language exists only within meaning, therefore within story, that there's nothing possible without it. And the tendency is often to think that language describes what exists, but actually language makes what exists. Nothing exists outside of language. And even scientifically, when you imagine how you see, you don't see anything. You only see reflected light. So you never really see a chair. You see the reflection of a chair. So the only thing that makes things real are stories, things that the narratives that we can agree upon. That is why language is also the greatest weapon of empire. Right? So we don't talk about killing Iraqi civilians, we say insurgents. And the moment you start to do that, you begin to dehumanize people. It is so ridiculous that we're caught in a debate around immigration, that we're trying to create positive narratives of immigrants when even anti-immigration Americans pride themselves on being immigrants. The paradox is mind-boggling. It is literally like saying, I am so proud that I am a person, but all people should be killed. It is, so for me, that kind of paradox means that we're not really talking about immigration at all. We're talking about the terms of humanity that are being brought to specific bodies. So when we say immigrants, when people use that word, they don't really mean, they just mean those other people. So, for instance, in Nigeria, one of the largest, I think it's probably the second largest ethnic group are the Yoruba. The Yoruba are made up of about 50 nation states. The word Yoruba is actually not a Yoruba word. It's a word given to them by the Hausa, who are the largest ethnic group, and it means those people. So one of the feats that the Yoruba did was to take what is really a term of dismissal and turn it into empires of power. So what we have to do is, whether you have an American passport or not, if you have spent 15 years of your life in a place, you are from that place. I'm sorry. Where else are you from? And so, because the stories you even have of yourself can no longer fit into the place you came from. So I think perhaps one of the things we need to do is to stop talking about Americans and immigrants and start talking about Americans. If we start to change the linguistic framework and begin to really talk about the fact that what we're trying to do is create subhuman groups within a larger human group and resist that as much as we can.
Yeah, I'd like to just chime in on that question because I have so much to say about it, but I'll try to keep my comments short. The question of not only how stories affect politics, but also how politics affect the way we can tell our stories is a really pressing one for me because the stories that undocumented immigrants can tell for advocacy are so constrained in so many ways. So one example is in all of the clips that you saw, the Dreamers really emphasize that they're American, that this is the only country that they've known, that their country isn't recognizing them, that they still owe their country something, their country being the U.S. And any semblance of the sort of transnational ties that Garth was talking about are totally played down. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that can't become part of the political activist discourse because that's not going to do what they want the stories to do. And you also, I think, made reference to sort of good immigrant stories versus bad immigrant stories. And of course, one of the arguments for the DREAM Act all along has been, well, these kids had no choice in what they were doing, implying the people who did have a choice are the bad immigrants, right? And so a lot of the debate around the DREAM Act is, well, will we be granting these children legitimacy and then opening up an opportunity for them to legalize their parents who are the bad, implied, right, bad immigrants who made the criminal decision. And DREAM activists, my sense from talking to them is that they really struggle with this because they don't want to buy into that narrative that their parents are the bad immigrants who committed crimes. But they do somehow, to some degree, need to play into the narrative that they had no control over their decision. So what I see in the public story is this narrative of incredible debt to their parents and recognition that their parents sacrificed and in private even more so, you know, like I'm hoping, the thing that doesn't get articulated is I am hoping that by getting legalized myself, I could maybe make a way in for my parents, but that can't be part of the public story because it's dangerous. There's an article called The Framing of Immigration by two guys named Lakoff and Ferguson that talks a lot about how the ways that we talk about things allow us to see certain things as problems and certain things as solutions and not see other things as problems and other things as solutions. So they use the example, if you say lobbying reform, then what you're focusing on as the problem is lobbying. And so all of the solutions that you're going to be able to understand to that problem have to do with regulations for lobbyists. But what if you said congressional ethics reform instead? Then that sort of shifts our focus. And what they say is, when you call it immigration reform, you're saying the problem is immigration and immigrants. We could call it human rights reform. We could call it civil rights reform. We could call it labor reform. We could call it a lot of things that would shift the problem. But by calling it immigration reform, we kind of keep our eyes squarely on the people coming over as the problem.
I'd like to address the second and third questions, and having to do with the close-knit family dynamics and whether that stays in the successive generations, and then also the question of how immigration affects children. And I will run those together in some sense. And I'll preface it by saying that as I started my talk earlier on, because we're talking about this generalization called Africa, the variation is vast within both of those dynamics. So it necessitates a kind of gross generalization. But I think what we see, and I wish my friend Glenn Adams was here from KU, whose work is focused on social psychology, and having to do with the different notions of self. Because I think this does play a role in many Africans' experience in the United States, where, and again, this is gross generalization, but there are many African cultures in which personhood is not as individuated as it is in the United States. And the easiest way to think of this is that there are more than 800 languages in Africa that have a phrase in them that we can roughly translate as we do in Swahili by saying a person is people. I am not a person without other people. And this is something that is very deeply ingrained in so many people. And coming into the United States, where we have a very strong sense of the kind of libertarian individuation of self, there's a clash, and that's a very strong struggle for many people in that next generation, as they're bombarded every day with the message of America, who says you can't have it all. And in most cases, they're in families that are saying, I say you can't have it all because it all belongs to everybody in this family. And so I think that that's a constant tension in a lot of the families of Africans that I know who've lived in the United States. And I think that is probably, in many respects, there are lots of tangible physical manifestations of the effects of immigration on children, but that's the biggest challenge, is facing that as Africans who are often born in the United States and grow up in this context and have to contend with these competing forces of who they are. And I think that's I guess, an answer to both of them.
That's great, thank you. I love that. That's like a little crash course. I'm learning so much here already. So for years in England, when I was in grad school, I worked in the welfare office, which means I basically help people process claims for welfare and housing. And also here, I've done a lot of work in Boise, Idaho, with recent immigrant, and I call them forced migrant communities. So if you look at the intimate space before you look at the legal space, you watch a very difficult thing happens at a very basic linguistic level. Children between 8 and 12 have to come with their parents who don't speak very good English to translate complex laws about how their families are facing eviction, how to get help from the government. In an African family where there's so much notions around what is appropriate and what is shameful, these children are struggling with the way children, and not all children, are ashamed of their parents, as they rightly should be, because there are problems. So there's that level of it, just simply that idea, but then to compound it with a child who's looking at someone who they're trying to talk about, they're trying to help their parents, talk about a thing that they're not even supposed to know about. And watch the scorn being directed at their parents and have to translate this scorn or mitigate the scorn. So this child is absorbing levels of shame that have nothing and are just immoral in many ways to put a child through. And then you start to see then, as I started to work a lot in then juvenile homes, that there's then a lot of young male African recent immigrants who end up in these places because the shame, they are not seen. They can't be seen the way they want to be seen at home. Their parents don't know how to process their masculinity within an American context. The American experience of masculinity is with the police force or with these kinds of authorities. And so then their rebellion gets magnified. And then, so I'm talking about, we are looking at generations of shame that at a very human level, before a legal level, we have to figure out ways to help process. When we listen to the young Nigerian woman, what does it mean to be, as a Nigerian myself, I couldn't go home for other reasons for my father's funeral, but what does it mean to be exiled from your own grief in this way? To feel that shame of not being able to be there at that moment for your parent. And I completely understand the cell phone, because even though my mother was English and died in England, I still actually have her cell phone number in my phone, and the most bizarre thing happened last year. I didn't know my brother kept her cell phone and has been paying the subscription. So 4 a.m. one night, my phone rings and it's like, Mom is calling. I answer the phone, I go, Mom? My brother says, oh man, sorry man, I butt dialed you. So when we're computing, this is the sort of the stories I'm talking about, that when we're computing things only in terms of legal activism, we forget these very primordial human conditions that are so important, which is why I love this idea of changing it from immigration reform to human rights reform.
So, for our second round of questions and comments.
Okay, I walked in as a Kenyan. I was sitting here, I became an immigrant, and now I'm living as an American. You have totally confused me. Totally confused, because I've been here for 25 years. And now I come to a realization when I go back home and I put a remark and they tell me I'm so Western. Mm-hmm. They think I know it all. When I say something, it's so simple. They like, you're an American now. You come from the West. So I'm dismissed so fast, you know. But today, I guess I'm living as an American. Early on, you talked about what children go through. I worked as a social worker. I speak 7 languages, and I translated a lot. And one of my saddest cases was a Sudanese family. The kid would not talk, and they already labeled the kid as a troublemaker. Kept himself. The teacher sent messages home, messages home, messages home. Finally started pinning letters on the shirt, little knowing that the parents don't even speak English. So the mother is taking these letters nicely, putting them in a folder, thinking that, oh, my son has done something really great. But this is all tardiness. So we have to do a lot.
I can just jump in on that before I forget it. There was a story when I was in Zanzibar doing some research about 12 years ago, and one of my friends from Lawrence, who is Zanzibari, was home in Zanzibar at the same time, and he came to visit me at my house when I wasn't there in Zanzibar, and the gardener in the property said, somebody came to see you. And I said, a Swahili or a Zanzibari or a white person. And he had this shrug that lasted forever, and he said, if he's a Zanzibari, he's been gone for a very long time.
Do you have any other comments or questions?
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I do have a question. There's a Senegalese writer called Fatou Diom, and she has a novel, well, she has several, but one is roughly translated as The Belly of the Atlantic. And she talks a lot about the fact that French immigrants who migrate to West Africa, they are all referred to as expats versus immigrant, refugees, aliens. So I wonder what maybe the current research is on Americans who are migrating to the American continent as well as the African continent, and how are they being perceived? Because we often think of immigration as a one-way, people only going to Europe and coming to the US, but perhaps your thoughts on the other side and how that is affecting the immigrants who are forced to come here and the exploitation of that other immigrant.
As a Nigerian will tell you, money cooks good soup. So expat means you have money. That's what it means. You came here with a lot of money. We want it. For instance, the relocation of Koreans to America who were displaced from South Korea, they arrived with a lot of money. It's the largest population in Los Angeles. Actually, it's the largest population of Koreans outside of Seoul. They were never referred to as immigrants or refugees in any of these difficult ways. So it always seems that capital has a lot to do with some of those things. But I always like to make these things a little more problematic than simply US versus us. I know it's happening here, but it's really best to understand this at a human level. Then we can find the stories to address some of those anxieties. When the civil war in Schad, which is just on top of Nigeria, displaced a lot of people, they flooded into Nigeria. Very light-skinned mixtures of Wodabe and Fulani, and they were just being rounded up. They were begging in the streets. They were being rounded up in trucks by the army and driven back across the border into the war. I'm one of those people who's never recognized as being where I'm from. So many times I ended up in those trucks on the way back to Schad, and it's just because I speak lots of Nigerian languages. In 1983, Nigeria gave Ghanaians 48 hours to leave the country and moved them out forcibly in trucks. The phrase Ghana must go is where that comes from. So just to say that there is something that threatens an identity of a people who live somewhere by people who come there. And I think that if we understand some of those anxieties, we also move the conversation slightly outside of simply an us and them and start to talk at a very human level. If you just watch the film Gangs of New York, you realize that this is a problem that Americans have been dealing with for a long time. Once the Irish established themselves and then they started fighting the Dutch, the Jews were not welcome, the Japanese were in turn. It's a process we're very good at. But what it always starts with is a linguistic framework that dehumanizes the other person. And I think that's really, for me, where a lot of the change will occur, is if we start to revisit the terms.
Hi, my name is Diane. Thank you for this conversation. I mostly have a comment. I think one thing that really resonates with me, and I think the woman in the front and you on the panel spoke to it, was this notion of this difference in quote-unquote Black Americans and African immigrants. And I've been engaged in Movement for Black Lives work here in Kansas City, and one of the discussions we often have is we need to talk about all Black Lives Matter. And I think the way in which Black immigrants are pitted against African Americans, when African Americans don't even feel like they are American in and of themselves, and Black folks want to leave this country because we are not American, we've never been American, and how that is used, the anti-Blackness is used within our communities. And so I appreciate the fact that this conversation is happening. I wish that there were more Black folks here, African Americans. It's a very mixed crowd, right? I wish there were more Black African Americans here to talk about this, because we often disconnect. We push ourselves away from the immigrant or migration experience when we are in fact ourselves, we're forced migrants, right? And so I wish this conversation, I'm glad it's happening, and I want to continue this because we need to continue to talk about the intersectionality, particularly amongst Black folks here in the United States.
I just thought that was a really great point, the difference in words between expat and immigrant, and I was just wondering, since you're a writer, can you come up with that word for us?
Sorry, can I do what with it? Come up with a word for expats?
Well, no, one that has a more positive connotation that includes all people and doesn't have a negative connotation for some people, like immigrant does for some people.
People? I think that word is already being come up with. I think we're complicated. It's funny because we're talking about languages in all these ways, and most West African languages, for instance, don't have gender pronouns. I don't know if you knew this. So even how gender is negotiated is way more fluid than we tend to give it understanding. So this notion of corporate selves, like an amalgamation of multiple beings, is really part of it. And South Africans have a word for it. I think it's called Ubuntu. So it's really this idea about we are more human based on what humanity has reflected back at us. So if we start from the idea that we're people, it helps. And I like the point about sort of the way in which Africans and African Americans are pitted against each other. But there's also like complicated reasons for that. I mean, it's difficult for someone who is being forcibly removed from a continent and over 300 years systematically subjected to a narrative of shame that is connected to that place. People talk about former slaves as though there is a country of slaves. There's a continent of Africans who were enslaved. And so there's an understandable, complicated relationship to that. And there's also the ways in which I think privilege is a really tricky word. Because it is often only applied to certain kinds of contexts. But if you arrive in this country, no matter how forced your recent migration is, you arrive with a full historical context for yourself, which an African American doesn't have. And not acknowledging that privilege and then riding on the backs of sacrifices made by Africans who were here before you and never acknowledging that also generates these kinds of complicated relationships. So I think the difficulty we're always facing is how to have adult conversations, right? The general narrative of slavery is that some white people turned up and said, here's some funky glass beads, some of your brothers, and we were all dancing on the beach. You're like, whoa, beads here, right? It doesn't deal with the complex empires in Africa, the ways in which people made deals to remove opponents to amalgamate land. But if we say that we were also part of the transatlantic slave trade, then whiteness exculpates itself and says, see, it's them. And caught between this are a group of Africans in the diaspora who've never really had that addressed. Ghana is the only country in Africa that has actually formally apologized for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. So this is what I mean by adult conversations. It has to kind of evolve into these ways in which we start picking sides and we start to acknowledge, not in a hierarchy of my people's pain is more than your people's pain, but just simply, look, here's what we're dealing with. Right? Everyone has to deal with this, and let's figure out a way as people to deal with this. And I think the reason why Americans always default away from calling themselves refugees is because there is a certain self-loathing attached to that idea. We come here to reinvent ourselves, and then we soldier on until someone else says, well, you have more privilege than I do. And then we're like, well, listen here, Charles. When my people came here, they were Scottish, and so it's like we're always playing this one-upmanship. So I think people, if we just went back to just calling each other people, fucked up people, it would be a good way to move forward. Anyway.
Just a tiny little comment, but I was thinking about a documentary called Crossing Arizona, which is obviously about Mexican and Central American primarily migration and the impact on Arizona, but everybody gets a chance to speak, right? So the Border Patrol, the Minutemen vigilantes, the humanitarian groups that put water on the border. There's no overhead commentary, so everybody just speaks for themselves, but something that's always struck me about that documentary is all the people who, the Minutemen and the Border Patrol, they speak in terms of government, securing borders, and patriotism and country. It's language of nation. And the humanitarian groups that put water out on the border, they speak in terms of human beings and humanitarian and humanity. And the striking difference that that framing makes has always really stayed with me.
I just wanted to add, as I've been thinking about this, that, this is about stories about migration, and in a lot of senses, I've really tried to practice what I call the shut up and listen mode. So I'm a bit discomforted by the fact that I'm actually having to talk, because I think I would argue that this whole project's objective is to shut up and listen. Yeah. And I think that is where we have the adult conversations, when people learn to listen. And it's been something I have worked hard to practice as someone from outside of Africa and from outside of African communities in the diaspora and on the continent. To learn from those stories. And I guess what I would say is what I've learned most is about humanity, my own humanity, and my relations to it, and to attempt to, in a practical sense too, to take those lessons into my own life and my own profession and my own teaching, because I think that both African places and African peoples have a lot to teach America and American people in ways that are both subtle and grand. And some of these have to do with just being a better person. And I guess I'd leave it at that.
Well, that actually might be an appropriate place to stop, since we're just about out of time. I want to take this opportunity to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Mackenzie Jones, who is the Assistant Director for the Kansas African Studies Center, and without whom we would never have been able to have had this forum. I'd like to thank Jessica Irving, who is the master designer for all our materials, and without whom we would not have any programs today or anything like it. Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to thank my co-director, Liz McGonigal, for all the work that she has done on this project and is about to do as we move forward. Thank you, Liz. And Jonathan Perkins and Kia Cunningham with the Emil Geringer Academic Resource Center, and they were crucial for all the assistance with the technology. Thank you very much, Kia and Jonathan. And I would like to thank all of you for your participation in this. The questions and comments were excellent, and I think engaged the panelists. So thank you very much to all of you. And finally, thank you to our panelists, Marta, Garth, and Chris, for your excellent presentations and for your time.
Thank you.